One of the most confusing pieces of photography to understand is aperture. What does it mean when a lens has an aperture of f4 or f8? What does it mean when my aperture is wide open or when it's closed down? Why does that affect my depth of field? And what is depth of field? The list goes on. But if you want to get the most out of your photos, you have to have an understanding of how aperture works and how to apply it to your photography. So today we are going to be diving into one of the most confusing and misunderstood topics of all of photography, and that is aperture. We're going to unpack what it means and how it applies to your photos, how you can use aperture and understand it easily, simply, without the technical jargon. Let's get to it. Alright, so let's make this as simple and basic as possible. Aperture, if you look up the technical definition, is just an opening that light comes through. So what does that mean for us photographers? It means that the aperture of your lens, is the hole that lets light go through this lens out the other side to your camera. You follow me? So the size of that hole actually changes, and that's done by a little mechanical thing inside of your lens that opens and closes and changes the size of that hole. So it's changing the size of the aperture. That is called the iris. So I have this vintage lens here, and I'm going to just hold it up to the camera and show you what I mean. The aperture is the hole through which you're seeing light. So I can hold it up to this camera and you can see it getting larger and smaller. Well, it's getting larger and smaller because I am actually adjusting the iris. So when you stop down or stop up, change the f number of your lens, and we will talk about what that means in a second. The hole is getting larger and smaller because of the iris. Okay, so we have that technical definition out of the way. Aperture is just the size of the hole in the camera, and that's changed by the iris, right? Well, the next thing that we have to ask is, what does it mean when a lens is f4 or f8 or f16 or f1.4? What do those numbers mean, and how does that have anything to do with aperture? Great question. So the f number of a lens is also known as the f-stop. The f stands for focal length, and focal length is just the length of the lens, how long it is in millimeters. You got it? Now, we take the focal length and we divide it by the aperture, which again is the size of that hole measured in millimeters across, and we get our f-stop number. So if you have a 35mm lens, an 85, a 50mm, a 7200, those are all the length of the actual barrel of the lens. If you take these two numbers and you divide them, that's how you get that number that comes after the f, whether it's f4, f6, f8. So let's look at a quick example. This will start to make sense. Just track with me for another second, okay? So this is a 50mm lens. So obviously it's 50mm long. That's the focal length. Now, if the aperture, we took a measuring tape and we measured that hole in the lens and it happened to be 36mm, if we actually divide this out, you would get 1.4. So this particular lens at this particular aperture setting would happen to be f1.4. That's where that number comes from. And typically when you actually look at the speed of a lens, what's known as the speed of a lens is just the maximum width of this number down here, the maximum width that that hole opens up to let light in. So here's the question that you should be asking: why does this actually matter, Ryan? So this is actually super helpful to us as photographers because it lets us compare the brightness of different lenses even if they have completely different focal lengths. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say that I were to go and get a bunch of different food. I got a pizza, an ice cream cone, a steak, and a donut, right? They all have very different qualities, completely different foods. But what do? We compare the calories. Now, technically, a calorie is the calculation of the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of a kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Now, practically, does that matter to us? No. But because they've come up with this equation, it allows us to compare the energy value of food from one completely different food to another. Now that's what aperture does. Let's say I've got my camera out in the park and I'm taking a walk and I see a bear. So I pull out my camera and I take a photograph using my 70mm zoom lens. So I've got it set at 70mm and it's f2.8 because I want to get nice and close to that bear. Now let's say 30 seconds later that bear starts running towards me and I'm too stupid to run away. So I say, oh shoot, I can't fit the bear in my frame anymore. I have to switch to my 35mm. I wonder what settings I should set my camera to. Now, as long as I set my 35mm lens to the same aperture as I had my 70mm lens, my shot will still be exposed properly without changing any of my camera settings. Super handy, right? So as long as my aperture stays the same, I don't have to change any of my camera settings. See how handy that is? So the real question is, now that we kind of know what aperture is and where those numbers come from, how do we actually apply this into our photography? And how do we understand where to set that number? How do we get our mind kind of around what f4 means and f16 means and what that all does? What it comes down to is when you look at that equation, it winds up meaning this. The higher that f number becomes, the smaller your aperture must be. Now this matters because obviously the smaller the hole gets, the less light that is going to go through that lens, and the less light that goes through that lens, the darker it's going to be. And so it's going to be harder to get a well-exposed image. Now what does well-exposed mean? Let's say I'm taking a photo of a bear and it's 9 o'clock at night, and I take the photo and it looks like this. Not very helpful, right? That's not well exposed. But if I take a photo of the bear and I can see everything I want to see, that's a well exposed image. So if I don't have much light coming into my lens, it's way harder to do that, because all I can do to make that image better exposed is decrease my shutter speed, in which case if the bear is charging at me, it's going to be totally blurry. Or I can increase my ISO, and the higher the ISO goes, the more grainy and mushy and just kind of gross looking. So obviously we don't want this. When we're in a low light environment, that's why you really want a lens that has an aperture that is very wide. It's a big hole, it lets a lot of light into the lens, and it's easier to get well exposed images. Now, the thing that gets a little bit confusing about that is obviously the higher the f number, the smaller the aperture. It's backwards of what you would expect. I've got an easy way to remember this. Okay, here's the makes sense definition. Pretend that the F stands for number of foxes, all right? Bear with me for a second. Let's say that you are fighting foxes in the park, and the bear has left. You're fighting foxes now, and there's one fox at first, and you can see pretty well. But let's say that 15,000 foxes come and they're in one giant fox herd and they're all in front of you and you can't see anything, and it just gets dark because the foxes are blotting out the sky. That's how dark it is. There's that many foxes. That fox number increasing is going to get darker and darker and darker until we can't see anything and the park is just one big black mess. Now let's say that someone fires a gun, it's an anti-fox repellent, and the foxes start running out of the way. They're lowering. The F number is going down, 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 and the lower that F number gets, the less foxes there are, the brighter everything becomes, because all of a sudden we can see the sky, we can see the trees, and we can start taking photos again because we can see what we're doing. Now obviously, because the less light you let into your lens, the harder it's going to be to get a well-exposed image, the question you then ask is, should I then just leave my aperture as wide open as possible all of the time? And the answer is no. Why? Because aperture does something else other than just kind of determine how much light gets into the lens. It also determines something called depth of field. Now, what is depth of field? Well, we could be technical about it and talk about how much of the image is in focus, but really, look at this image, see how blurry it is in the background? That's depth of field. So if you have a very shallow depth of field, that means that up here where you can't see in the image, up front, up close, it would be in focus, but the background is super, super out of focus because the depth of field, the amount of that image that's in focus, is very shallow. Now, if that explanation didn't make sense, let me show you in a chart, because everyone loves charts. Let's say you're here and you've got your camera and you're looking just hot stuff, right? And we're set up in the local park and you're looking and bam, a bison comes into view. It's, wow, what a majestic bison. I should take a photo of that bison. And then you see, oh, there's a fox and the bison is chasing the fox. And then you say, wait, no, the bison is chasing the fox, which is chasing a duck. Great, we want to take a photo of all of this. If we want to take a photo of all of these things, which are spread out from 5 feet away to you to 25 feet away from you, you're going to need a very wide depth of field. You're going to need a lot of your image to be in focus. So you're going to determine what your aperture is set to based around that, because this is how aperture works in depth of field. So let's pretend we have a lens here with an aperture of f1.2. That means the aperture is wide open. That hole is really big, letting lots of light in. Now we're not going to explain in this video exactly how focusing works on a lens, but suffice it to say, the way that a lens focuses light is it grabs light and takes it down to one particular point that all becomes in focus. Now that one point is symbolized by these converging lines here. That's the in focus portion of this image. And in this particular lens diagram, it's set to about 12 feet. That's where everything comes into focus. Now on either side, you see these red lines? Those are the points in the image that are still pretty sharp. So they're not as sharp as this one point here that is completely in focus, but they're still visibly to your eye. They look like more or less they're in focus. That's called your depth of field. From this far point here, that's still pretty sharp, to this closer point here, that is still reasonably sharp. All right, everything that falls outside of these two lines is considered to be out of focus. When you look at it with your eye, it looks a little bit blurry, whether it's closer towards you, like our friend here, Mr. Bison, or farther away, like friend here, Mr. Duck. Now, that's with an aperture of f1.2. Now, let's say that I actually took my aperture and I set it smaller. So I closed it down and I set it to say f16. So now, because we're using an aperture of f16, you can see the light actually entering this lens is doing so at a much shallower angle compared to our f1.2 lens. Look at that angle compared to this angle. And therefore, the point that gets resolved, the point that's in focus in our lens, and the acceptable in focus distance is quite a bit broader. You can see that now Mr. Bison and Mr. Duck are somewhat in focus. Now, if we stopped it down even further to say f32, this would be even increased again, and probably our whole Mr. Bison and whole Mr. Duck would also be in focus. So that's how we would determine whether or not we want to use something like f1.2 or f16. How much of the image do we actually need to get in focus? If we just want the focus to be on our fox and have everything else made blurry, then we would do something like f1.2. If, however, we want to capture our entire scene, then we would do something a little bit more like f16, where we have a much broader depth of field. And so you can see that the way you set your aperture and the settings you choose really depends on what you want to get out of that specific situation. For instance, with this portrait shoot, we wanted to separate this couple from the background. And so you can see just how out of focus the background is because our aperture was wide open and we were using a tighter lens. However, in this photo over here, you can see that everything in this photo is in focus, and that's a good thing. You don't want to have all of the background out of focus when the background is kind of part of the image and you're showing that off. So it really depends on what you want to get out of the situation. So if we're going to recap absolutely everything in 10 seconds, aperture is the hole in your lens. This is controlled by the iris, which is that metal thingy that changes the size of the hole in your lens. The F numbers, what do they stand for? The f-stop is a measurement of how much light reaches the lens by dividing the focal length of that lens by the aperture, the width of its opening. This matters because it gives us a rough number where we can actually compare brightnesses across different lenses of different focal lengths. And so what that all comes down to is the higher that f number is, the smaller the aperture. It's a little backwards, so the way to remember that is basically pretending that f stands for number of foxes standing in front of your camera. You add foxes, you're going to get less light in your camera, and so it's going to get darker. You take away foxes, you reduce that f number, the lower it is, you have more light coming into your camera, so things are brighter. Now, does aperture do anything else other than just let light in? Yes, it increases and decreases the depth of field depending on what you set your aperture to. So the lower that f number, the shallower your depth of field, the more out of focus everything else is going to become. This happens because of the actual mechanics behind a lens and the angle of light coming into the lens. So in the end, the actual correct aperture for any given image is going to depend on what you want out of that photo. Do you want the entire background and everything in that photo to be in focus? Use a high aperture, f8, f16. Whereas if you want to really blow out the background, have it super soft, out of focus, and dreamy just to place more emphasis on your subjects, well, then you want to use a lower aperture, something like f1.4, f2.8. And most of the time, as a general rule, you want to have your aperture as wide as you can to maximize the amount of light coming into that camera so that your image quality is better, and that out of focus look does tend to add more emphasis on your photos. So as we go through here and we look, you can see that this was with f1.4, f4, f1.8. In general, you'll find that most of the time we are shooting with lower apertures, and that's why lenses that have lower apertures are more expensive. They let more light into the camera, and they also produce those really out of focus backgrounds. So that is aperture in a nutshell. Whew, so there you have it. Everything you ever wanted to know about aperture, and probably a little bit more. If this video was helpful, please make sure to hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe for more great content and training, and leave me a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. What other topics should we cover in the future? And if you want to get some free presets or just stay updated with new content and business growing strategies for your photography, make sure to head over to signatureedits.com and get signed up today. All right, I'll see you in the next one.